Me and my beautiful work mom. Hey. We are so cute. Y'all know we're sophisticated. They run up on us. They know what's up. We the realest in this motherfucker. Hey, tell them, Pauletta.
Yes. We kick some asses and
boom,
take
boom.
names later.
And they love us say, Got the Japanese hype in the
I see
Women Crush Wednesday, bitch.
On the night of December 27th, 2024, the streets of Springfield, Kentucky, were quiet. Christmas decorations still hung in windows, a reminder of a holiday that had passed just days before. Inside a small home on Claybrook Avenue, a mother and daughter were settling in for the night, unaware that danger was just outside their door. Within minutes, their world would be shattered by the sound of gunfire. 31-year-old Cadesha Birch, a devoted mother of two, had spent the past few months fighting to reclaim her life. Just days earlier, she had posted bond after being charged with a crime many believed was an act of self-defense. She had hoped for a fresh start, a chance to move forward and put the past behind her. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching, waiting for the moment she let her guard down. That person was Roosevelt Davis, a man she had once trusted, a man who had once promised to love her. What could drive someone to cross state lines with the sole intention of killing? How did a relationship that had once seemed so full of promise become a story of obsession, violence, and revenge? This is the story of Cadesha Birch, a woman who fought for her life, and the man who refused to let her go. Springfield, Kentucky, was the kind of place where most people knew their neighbors. It wasn't a city where headlines were dominated by violence, and it certainly wasn't a place where a young mother's life should have ended in a hail of bullets. But before the crime, before the shockwaves that would ripple through the community, there was Cadesha Birch, a woman defined not by how she died, but by how she lived. Cadesha was 31 years old, a devoted mother of two young boys. To those who knew her best, she wasn't just another name in a tragic story. She was Dada, the friend who never let anyone feel alone, the mother who put her children's needs before anything else, the woman who saw through the surface and into the hearts of the people around her. If you were struggling, Cadesha knew, and she cared. Her best friend, Emily Todd Mann, remembered how Cadesha had a way of making people feel seen, even when they weren't asking to be noticed. There was no casual "I'm fine with her." Cadesha wouldn't accept it. She would push past the surface, insisting on the truth. That was who she was. Someone who loved with an open heart. Someone who refused to ignore the pain of others. It was why so many people showed up for her vigil, lining the streets in their cars, desperate to show that her life had mattered. Yet for all her warmth, for all her kindness, Cadesha's life had not been easy. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Here at Explosive True Crime Stories, we uncover shocking cases, mysterious disappearances, and mind-blowing investigations, bringing you the facts, the twists, and the truth. Got a case you want us to cover? Drop it in the comments. Your next obsession starts here. Fire subscribe now for the most explosive true crime stories. There were struggles she didn't always speak about, battles she fought in silence. She had her children young and dedicated herself to raising them, leaving little time for anything else. Her world revolved around them. No matter what, their well-being came first. Even in the hardest times, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, she never wanted them to feel the burden of her pain. And then there was Roosevelt Davis, a name that would eventually be etched into the darkest part of her story. But in the beginning, he wasn't a villain. He was just a man, someone who had once had dreams of his own, a promising football player who had shown flashes of ambition and potential. When they first met, Cadesha believed in him. Maybe that was her mistake, believing that love could change someone, that patience could heal what was broken. At first, their relationship seemed full of promise. There was laughter. There were plans for a future. There was hope. They had a child together, something that should have strengthened their bond. Instead, it became the weight that began pulling them under. Over time, Roosevelt's behavior changed. His temper flared more often. His moods became unpredictable. His words cut deeper. The man who had once been full of charm became someone who could no longer hide the anger boiling beneath the surface. It wasn't just words. The violence didn't begin all at once. It never does. It started with small things. A push, a slammed door, a moment that passed quickly enough to be excused. But soon, the moments added up, each one erasing the line that should have never been crossed. Eventually, Cadesha found herself trapped in a cycle of fear, where apologies came too late and bruises told the truth that words couldn't. Her friends noticed. They saw the way her once bright energy seemed dimmer, the way she started to shrink into herself. They knew something was wrong, but knowing isn't always enough. In situations like these, walking away isn't as simple as it seems. Love doesn't erase fear, but fear doesn't always erase love either. By October 2024, things had reached a boiling point. There was no mistaking it anymore. This was not just a bad relationship. This was survival. On October 5th, after hours of fighting, Roosevelt put his hands around Cadesha's throat. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And in that moment, she had a choice. Let him kill her or fight back. She fought. Somehow, she managed to break free. She grabbed a gun and fired. The bullets hit Roosevelt's leg. It should have ended there. It should have been enough. But it wasn't. Instead of being seen as a woman defending herself, Cadesha was arrested. Attempted murder, the charge that followed her for months, the weight that hung over her head as she sat behind bars, separated from her children, waiting for the system to decide her fate. Her family fought for her release, desperate to bring her home. She was the victim, but she was the one behind bars. Meanwhile, Roosevelt, the man who had driven her to that breaking point, walked free. The system had failed her in the most fundamental way. It punished her for fighting back, while the man who had nearly taken her life was allowed to move forward with his. And yet, even in those dark months, Cadesha held on to hope. When she was finally released on bond just days before Christmas, she saw it as a second chance. She posted a message online, thanking everyone who had supported her, overwhelmed with relief that she could spend the holidays with her children. She thought the worst was over. She thought she had made it through the storm. She had no idea that Roosevelt wasn't done. Because while Cadesha was making plans to rebuild her life, Roosevelt was making a plan of his own. He wasn't done with her. Not yet. The drive from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Springfield, Kentucky, takes nearly 7 hours. For most people, it's a long, uneventful stretch of road, filled with miles of open highway and endless time to think. Roosevelt Davis had all the time in the world to reconsider what he was about to do. Yet, with every passing mile, his rage only grew, tightening around him like a vice. Days earlier, Cadesha Birch had been released on bond, stepping into the open air as a free woman for the first time in months. She had survived. She had endured the legal battle that followed the night. She pulled the trigger on Roosevelt in self-defense. She had posted online, thanking the people who stood by her, expressing gratitude for the chance to spend Christmas with her children. Roosevelt read those words, and he seethed. She wasn't supposed to be happy. She wasn't supposed to walk away from him. Not after what she had done. He had been left humiliated, his power over her stripped away. Now he had one purpose, to take it back. It was a plan that required precision. He needed money. He needed weapons. And he wasn't willing to wait. On December 26, 2024, Roosevelt walked into a bank in Wisconsin, set on getting exactly what he needed. It wasn't a sloppy, desperate attempt. He was calm, calculated, in and out within minutes, gripping the stolen cash that would fund what came next. The money went straight into buying 2 guns. Not 1, 2. He purchased camouflage gear, as if preparing for a mission, rather than a murder. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, only forward motion. Then the drive began. Through the night, he crossed state lines, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind locked onto the outcome. There was no turning back. He was heading for Springfield, Kentucky. He was heading straight for Cadesha. It was just past midnight when Roosevelt arrived on Claybrook Avenue. The small neighborhood was asleep, the glow of Christmas lights still flickering in windows, untouched by the horror that was about to unfold. Inside the house, Cadesha Birch and her mother, Frances Campbell, were winding down from the day. There were no warning signs, no final phone calls or messages that hinted at what was coming. And then the front door exploded open. Roosevelt kicked it in with the kind of force that only comes from absolute, unwavering intent. The sound shattered the stillness of the night, sending a jolt through the walls of the home. There was no time to react, no time to process what was happening before gunfire tore through the air. The first shot hit Cadesha. The impact was immediate. She stumbled, the weight of the bullet stealing her breath, her body betraying her. More shots followed, each one cutting deeper, each one sealing the fate she had fought so hard to avoid. She had survived him before. She would not survive him this time. Frances Campbell barely had time to register what was happening before the gun turned on her. The bullet struck her, pain ripping through her body. She collapsed, but she was still breathing. Her mind screamed at her to move, to fight, but her limbs felt heavy, the weight of survival pressing down on her. Roosevelt didn't stay long. His work was done. He turned, stepping over the destruction he had left in his wake, walking back out the front door and into the night, as if nothing had happened. The car was waiting. The engine roared to life. And just like that, he was gone. Inside, silence settled over the home. A silence that wasn't supposed to be there. And then movement. Frances, somehow, despite the pain, despite the chaos, she found the strength to reach for her phone. 911. A weak voice. Words laced with agony. My daughter has been shot. The call set everything into motion. Police. Paramedics. The flashing lights that arrived too late. Cadesha Birch was gone. But Roosevelt Davis was still out there. And the hunt for him had just begun. The call to 911 came just after midnight. A voice, weak but determined, fought through the pain.
All Kentucky City is in mourning days after the mother of two young boys was killed in what police believe was a domestic violence situation.
As WDRB's Katrina Nickel tells us tonight, friends and family do not want her to be remembered as a victim.
That's the kind of friend that she is.
For Emily Todd Mann,
There's just no words, really.
the emotion is raw.
I grew up just over this hill, and she grew up over that way.
Reflecting on a life of one of her closest friends of 15 years.
It's hard to have a bad memory of her.
31-year-old Cadesha Birch was shot and killed on Friday inside this home in Springfield, Kentucky. Kentucky State Police says Roosevelt Davis admitted to robbing a bank in Wisconsin to buy two guns, then driving to Kentucky to kill Birch. Davis is the father of one of her two sons, and he's now charged with murder, domestic violence.
Even the strongest people that you know, this is proof that you can't escape without all of the help available to you.
Police say Davis also shot Birch's mom, Frances Campbell. Mann says she's going to be okay.
There needs to be a call for a protective watch on her mother and her children.
While Birch and her family are victims in this situation, that is not how Mann wants people to think of her friend. She says Birch will be remembered as the friend who cared so much that fine was never an okay answer to the question, how are you?
It just wasn't acceptable because she could just see straight through you.
She'll be remembered as a woman of faith.
98% of Springfield knew God because she believed in God still.
And she will live on through friends and family who will never forget a woman they say had the biggest heart.
She had a fantastic just call of her soul to love, plainly, freely, and because she could.
In Springfield, Kentucky, Katrina Nickel, WDRB News.
This wasn't just a domestic homicide. This was the deliberate, calculated murder of a mother, committed by a man who had planned every step. And what made it even more dangerous, Roosevelt wasn't just a fugitive. He was an armed fugitive. Authorities now had to track down a man who had already crossed state lines once and had no intention of stopping. It was clear that Roosevelt had thought ahead. He had left the house before anyone could stop him. He had made sure there were no cameras to capture him. He had vanished. But one mistake changed everything. A routine traffic stop turns into an arrest. A little after 3 in the morning, less than 3 hours after Cadesha took her last breath, an officer in Shelbyville, Kentucky, was stationed near an outlet mall, watching traffic speed down Interstate 64. Then he saw it. A Chevrolet Malibu flew past, moving faster than it should have been. The officer pulled onto the road and hit his lights, signaling for the driver to pull over. The car slowed, pulling to the side of the road. The officer approached, expecting nothing more than a routine traffic stop. But as he reached the driver's side, something didn't feel right. The man behind the wheel gave his license. The name on it? Roosevelt Davis. At that moment, the officer had no idea he was looking into the eyes of a murderer. He stepped back and ran the plates. And that's when everything changed. The name Roosevelt Davis came back flagged, wanted for a bank robbery in Wisconsin. That alone was enough to take him in. But the officer barely had time to process it before another alert came through. This was also the man Kentucky State Police were searching for in connection to a murder. Backup was called immediately. Within minutes, multiple officers surrounded the car. Roosevelt's hands were pulled behind his back. He didn't resist. And just like that, the man who had spent hours planning his perfect crime was in cuffs before the sun even had a chance to rise. The shocking confession. Once in custody, Roosevelt didn't stay silent. He told investigators everything. He admitted to robbing a bank in Wisconsin. He admitted to using the money to buy 2 guns. He admitted to driving to Kentucky with one goal, to kill Cadesha Birch. He didn't hesitate, didn't try to lie. The arrogance in his voice made it clear. He didn't feel regret. He felt justified. To him, this wasn't a crime. It was punishment. Roosevelt Davis had spent months losing control of Cadesha, and in his mind, her death was his way of taking it back. As the officers listened, one thing became chillingly clear. Cadesha never had a chance. She had survived him once. He made sure she wouldn't survive him twice. Now, the only question left was whether the justice system would finally protect the woman it had already failed once. Because this time, there was no escaping the truth. Roosevelt Davis had pulled the trigger, and the world was about to watch as he faced the consequences. Roosevelt Davis sat in the courtroom, his expression unreadable, his hands cuffed in his lap. This was the moment where the justice system would decide what his life would look like from this day forward. But for Cadesha Birch's family, there was no decision to make. The damage was done. The verdict wouldn't bring her back. The prosecution had a strong case, one built on undeniable evidence. There was no mystery here. No question of whether or not Roosevelt had pulled the trigger. He had admitted it himself. He had told investigators every step of his plan, from robbing a bank to buying weapons, to driving across state lines to end Cadesha's life. He hadn't just confessed. He had justified it. But in a courtroom, confessions weren't always enough. There was still a trial to be had, a defense to be mounted, and a jury that had to be convinced. The prosecution laid everything out in stark detail. They painted a picture of a man consumed by control, a man who refused to accept that the woman he had once claimed to love was no longer his to dominate. They called it what it was, an execution, a planned and deliberate murder, not a crime of passion, not a moment of lost control, but a cold, calculated decision. Evidence was stacked against him. The surveillance footage of Roosevelt entering the Wisconsin bank, walking out with stolen cash. The receipts proving he had purchased 2 guns and camouflage gear. The traffic stop in Shelbyville, Kentucky, where he was arrested with those same weapons still in his possession. His confession, one he gave without hesitation, without remorse. And then came the moment that silenced the courtroom. Frances Campbell, Cadesha's mother, took the stand. She walked in with the weight of grief pressing down on her, but she held her head high. She had survived that night for a reason, and that reason was to speak for her daughter. Her voice was steady, but the pain behind it was unmistakable. She described the sound of the door being kicked in, the feeling of helplessness as she saw Roosevelt standing there with a gun in his hand. She spoke about the gunfire, the chaos, the moment she realized Cadesha wasn't moving. And then she looked directly at Roosevelt, the man who had taken her daughter away. "You took everything from us." Her words cut through the silence, leaving the jury to sit with the weight of them. Roosevelt's defense team had an uphill battle. There was no doubt that he had committed the crime. Their job wasn't to prove his innocence. It was to find any possible way to lessen his sentence. They focused on his mental state. They brought in witnesses from his past, former coaches, teachers, people who had once believed Roosevelt had a bright future. They painted the picture of a young man who had lost his way, someone whose struggles with mental health had pushed him into a place of desperation. They spoke about his relationship with Cadesha, twisting moments from their past to suggest that she had provoked him, that she had played a role in his downfall. They pointed to her previous arrest, trying to frame it as part of a larger, more complicated history between them. But the prosecution shut that argument down quickly. They reminded the jury who the real victim was. Cadesha Birch had been trying to escape Roosevelt's control. She had defended herself against his violence. She had spent months in jail for it, only to be released and killed just days later. Roosevelt hadn't been pushed to commit this crime. He had planned it. He had made every decision deliberately. And that was all the jury needed to hear. After days of testimony, after hours of closing arguments, after weeks of waiting for justice, the jury returned with their decision. They found Roosevelt Davis guilty on all counts. Murder, attempted murder, burglary. Every charge laid out before him. Every action he had taken now carried a price. And then came the sentencing. No parole, no second chances. The same way he had given Cadesha none. In the back of the courtroom, her family held each other, tears falling down their faces. It wasn't victory. It wasn't healing. But it was something. Roosevelt was led away in chains, his face still emotionless, his future decided by a system that had failed to protect Cadesha when she needed it most. As he disappeared from sight, the question remained, why had it come to this? Why had Cadesha's cries for help been ignored? Why had she been the one arrested for fighting back, while Roosevelt had walked free long enough to come back and kill her? And most importantly, how many more women would suffer the same fate before real change was made? Justice had been served, but for Cadesha's family, for her children, for everyone who had loved her, it would never be enough. The gavel had fallen. The courtroom had emptied. The news had been broadcast. Roosevelt Davis would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the verdict didn't erase the pain. It didn't bring back Cadesha Birch. For her family, for her children, for the community that had come together in her name, there would be no real closure. The sentence had locked away the man responsible, but it couldn't undo what had been done. Cadesha was gone, and no amount of justice could change that. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavier. Reporters pressed microphones into the faces of grieving loved ones, asking, "How do you feel about the outcome?" As if there was an answer that could sum up something so profound. Her mother, Frances Campbell, still bearing the physical scars from that night, had only one response: "My daughter should still be here." It was a truth that no sentence, no verdict, no legal proceeding could alter. The most haunting consequence of Cadesha's murder wasn't just the empty seat at family gatherings or the silence that had replaced her laughter. It was the two young boys she left behind. One of them was Roosevelt's own son, a child who would grow up knowing that his father had murdered his mother. At the vigil held in Cadesha's honor, her eldest son had stood among the crowd, surrounded by mourners, yet so still, so calm. He had lost the most important person in his life, but his mother had prepared him to be strong. The weight of that was devastating. No child should have to learn resilience this way. Family members and friends gathered to ensure that Cadesha's boys wouldn't be forgotten in the tragedy. But nothing could replace what had been taken from them. They would hear stories about their mother, about the way she loved fiercely, about the way she refused to let her friends suffer in silence, about how she never took fine as an answer when she asked how someone was doing. But they would never hear her voice again. They would never feel her arms around them, never wake up to her presence in their home. And as much as people around them tried to fill that void, some things could never be replaced. Springfield, Kentucky, was not a place where crimes like this happened often. It was the kind of town where people looked out for each other, where neighbors waved from their porches, where a tragedy of this magnitude didn't just impact a single family. It shook the entire community. At Cadesha's vigil, cars lined the streets, stretching for blocks. People came from all over, from different counties, just to pay their respects. Some had known her personally. Others had only heard her story, but they came anyway, because something about what had happened to her felt deeply, painfully unfair. A pastor who had known Cadesha since she was a child spoke to the crowd. He had watched her grow up, had seen the joy she brought to others. Now, he stood before the people who loved her, trying to find the words to make sense of something senseless. "We can't bring her back," he said, "but we can make sure her name is never forgotten." That was the only comfort left to those who grieved her, to make sure that she wasn't remembered as a victim, but as the woman she truly was. Cadesha's story wasn't just about one woman. It was about a system that had failed her. She had fought back against an abuser, and instead of being protected, she had been jailed. She had spent months behind bars while the man who tried to strangle her walked free. And when she was finally released, when she thought she had a second chance, he came back and killed her. How many times had this happened before? How many women had been punished for defending themselves, only to be murdered when the system refused to keep them safe? Advocates for domestic violence survivors spoke out after Cadesha's death, calling for better protections, for policies that didn't criminalize women who fought back against their abusers. They argued that Cadesha's arrest had played a role in her death, that if she had been supported instead of prosecuted, she might still be alive. But would anything actually change? Would the next woman in Cadesha's position get the protection she deserved? Or would the cycle continue? Cadesha Birch should have been alive to raise her children. She should have been free to move forward, to rebuild, to heal. Instead, she became another name on a growing list of women taken by domestic violence. Her case was tragic. It was horrifying. But was it enough to wake people up? Or would the world simply move on, leaving behind a family in mourning and a town still trying to understand how something like this could have happened? One thing was certain. The pain of losing Cadesha would never fade. And for those who loved her, for those who gathered at her vigil, for the children who would grow up without her, the fight to make sure no one else suffered the way she did was far from over. Cadesha Birch's story is one that should never have existed. She should be here today, raising her children, laughing with her friends, building the future she fought so hard to reclaim. Instead, she became a name in a case file, another woman taken by domestic violence, another reminder that leaving an abuser doesn't always mean the danger is over. Her death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a failure of a system that punished her for defending herself, a failure of a society that too often waits until a woman is dead before taking her cries for help seriously. But the question now is, will we let her name be forgotten? How many more? Every single day, women just like Cadesha face the same terrifying reality. An abuser who won't let go. A justice system that looks the other way. A desperate attempt to escape that only leads to more danger. How many more will it take before real change happens? How many more names will be added to the list before people start listening? The power to make a difference. We can't bring Cadesha back, but we can make sure her story is heard. We can speak her name. We can raise awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and the failures that allow it to continue. And you, yes, you watching this right now, have the power to help. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, please don't wait. There are resources. There are people who will listen. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-SAFE. If you're afraid, if you feel trapped, reach out. There's a way out. And if you want to make sure more stories like Cadesha's don't get buried.
And new this morning, a GoFundMe account has been created to help pay for the funeral of a woman who died after she was shot last week in Washington County, about an hour southwest of Lexington. State police say 31-year-old Cadesha Birch was shot and killed inside a home on Claybrook Avenue in Springfield on Friday. According to investigators, another woman was also shot, but she survived. State police say the suspect, 23-year-old Roosevelt Davis, who knew the two, allegedly drove from Wisconsin, broke into their home, and shot them. According to his arrest citation, Davis admitted to robbing a bank in Wisconsin and using that money to buy 2 guns. State police say Davis was arrested after a traffic stop in Shelbyville. He's now charged with murder, attempted murder, and burglary. Meanwhile, a GoFundMe to help Cadesha Birch's family pay for her funeral has so far raised more than $10,000.
If you want to help shine a light on the injustices so many victims face, here's what you can do right now. White heavy check mark like this video. It may seem small, but it helps spread awareness. More engagement means more people see this story. White heavy check mark, share this with someone. A friend, a co-worker, a family member. Someone out there needs to hear this. White heavy check mark, subscribe to this channel. We cover real cases, Real victims, real injustices. And with every story we tell, we push for change. Justice for Cadesha doesn't end with a verdict. It ends when women like her stop being ignored, when no one else has to live in fear. Let's make sure her story means something. Let's make sure her name is never forgotten. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next case.